Hi, Dr. P here, and I'm going to talk about a trend in games that many of you may have noticed, but I think it's getting stronger and stronger as time passes, and that's the trend toward games that have an avatar. So what's an avatar? Well, this derives in great part from Dungeons and Dragons. It's something that represents the individual player and that things happen to, and the avatar also causes things to happen. So most commonly it's a humanoid. For example, in massively multiplayer online games, shooters, action games, or in role-playing games in general. In many war games there's an avatar, although it's an invisible avatar. It doesn't actually interact with the game directly. It's just a role-playing feature. Now, the avatar could be a spaceship, it could be a tank, as in World of Tanks, or some other vehicle, an airplane. It can even be a pizza shape like Pac-Man. But the key is that the player can put himself into that avatar. He can play that role. And if it's a visible avatar, then things can happen to that avatar, possibly including death. In many cases, if you lose your avatar, if your avatar is killed, you lose, at least temporarily. Now in other games you just respawn indefinitely or infinitely, and it doesn't matter too much. It varies from game to game. The invisible or virtual avatar can't be killed or destroyed and doesn't have direct interactions. There's not a piece or a visual representation for that avatar, but it's still a form of role-playing. Some avatars have a separate story provided by the developers, a separate personality. For example, Mario or Sonic, you know who they are, and you're playing those guys. In other cases, much less. And you can put more of yourself into it because nothing's been predetermined for you. Now, avatars are typical in tabletop role-playing games, which have had a strong influence in general on video games, but they've had a much weaker influence on board and card games. Role-playing games, tabletop role-playing games, are the bridge between video games and other tabletop games, but video games have sort of followed tabletop RPGs, and other board and card games have not. Casual games also much less commonly have an avatar, whereas the AAA video games almost always have an avatar. And abstract games don't have an avatar. There's no story with an abstract game. Why would there be a character? Because in effect, avatars are characters in a story. It may not be a story imposed by the game, but it's a story that the game allows the players to write for themselves. So, this is a form of role-playing and also a form of wish fulfillment. The player experiences the story through what happens to the avatar, and the player feels that the avatar is important. If you have a story, you have to have characters that the consumer cares about, and the avatar is something that a player normally is going to care about. So why have avatars become popular, and I think are increasingly popular? Well, people want to be there. They want to experience something not accessible in the real world. The old Avalon Hill slogan, and we're going back into the late 1950s, is "You're in command." Now, in many war games it's an invisible avatar, but still there's a role-playing aspect there. Perhaps also, as ordinary life is becoming less adventurous, it's more predictable, it's more stable. People's lives, especially young people's lives, are circumscribed by lots of rules and by helicopter parents and so on. Then people gravitate to games where they can try exciting different experiences. But lots of games don't have avatars. Most abstract games don't have avatars. That includes traditional games like chess and checkers, most card games, casual video games like Candy Crush Saga and Tetris and Bejeweled, and you could make a tremendous list. Many Euro-style board games and card games which are generally abstract in design with a story tacked on, a theme tacked on, what I call an atmosphere, those rarely have an avatar, but sometimes they do. Sweep of history games like Civilization, Britannia, History of the World, with very long time scales, don't have an avatar. The player is omniscient and undying. No person could live through the entire period. Now, is use of avatars increasing? Well, someone who knows all the published games in a year might be able to count from year to year, but of course there's nobody like that. I think the use of avatars is increasing. Certainly, it's hard to find a AAA video game that doesn't have an explicit avatar. And as games are used more and more to tell explicit stories, which is happening in video games certainly, avatars become close to necessary. So of course I'm thinking about designing games explicitly with avatars. I've done this in the past, but not deliberately. It just worked out that way. So typically my older games are large-scale war games such as Britannia, or battle games like Dragon Rage, Valley of the Four Winds, Swords and Wizardry, where there's an invisible avatar, the commander. My Screwage games, games that are not highly strategic but are designed to let people mess with their friends, like Bang, Nuclear War, Munchkin, they sometimes have an avatar. I do have a game forthcoming, Sea Kings from Worthington Publications, in which you're a Viking searching for land, wealth, and fame so that you can become a king in Scandinavia. And that has an actual avatar. And where that avatar is makes a difference. Another game forthcoming from Worthington, Pacific Convoy, there's the invisible avatar, the commander. But I have a number of games being considered by publishers that have avatars. For example, Star Princes, which is a science fiction war game, both strategic and tactical. Each player is the son or daughter of a king, and the king has died in mysterious circumstances, and his children are blaming each other for murdering the king, and they're fighting to see who's going to succeed to the throne. Each player has an actual piece, which is the prince or princess, and if he loses that piece, he loses the game. That piece is useful in combat, so there's always a temptation for the prince to get involved in combat, which puts him or her at risk of being killed. And a game frequently ends when somebody makes a desperate attack using his prince, and he loses that battle, and the prince doesn't get away, and he's killed. It focuses attention in ways that I didn't anticipate in what is otherwise a strategic and tactical game. My pirate game has an avatar. Some don't. It's true that in my pirate game, the avatar is largely immune to death, although he can suffer misfortunes. But that's a consequence of the romantic pirate notion, where the romantic pirates never die, even though historical pirates almost always died. And I have a couple zombie games. Zombie games don't always have avatars, but they often do, and these do. If you're designing a game as a model rather than as an abstract game, you should think about incorporating an avatar or avatars, because that's where games are going, and that's what attracts people.